Okay, so this is our lecture on the American Revolution, which follows the previous lecture, helpfully entitled The Coming of the Revolution, which we just finished talking about. Here are the key terms. Those of you who want to jot those down, you can pause the video real quickly and do so. Alright, so I'll move on to the first section of this lecture. Okay, so in our last lecture, that was the coming of the revolution, we left off with the fighting at Lexington and Concord. That was the last thing that we talked about, which is basically what started the American Revolution. Not surprisingly, when word about the fighting at Lexington and Concord got back to England, the home government, including both king and parliament, was seriously upset. And in retaliation for the American rebellion, the English government, the English Parliament rather, passed the Prohibitory Act. The Prohibitory Act, which declared that, quote, all manner of the American colonies' trade and commerce is and shall be prohibited, end quote, and that any ships found trading, quote, shall be forfeited to His Majesty as if the same were the ships and effects of open enemies, end quote. The goal of this legislation was, of course, to destroy the economies of the North American colonies by completely cutting them off from trade with the rest of the world, including other parts of the British Empire. The English politicians responsible for this legislation believed that if that happened, the colonists would be desperate to reunite with England. To enforce this law, the English Navy set up a blockade to make sure that the colonists didn't trade with anyone. So not only did American ships no longer have the king's protection, they could now be seized and fired upon and their crews impressed into the British service. Like so much else that Parliament had done vis-a-vis the colonies, this turned out to be exactly the wrong thing to do. It ended up driving many of those who initially hadn't supported the revolutionary cause into the Patriot camp. Moreover, while the Prohibitory Act stopped some trade with the colonies, many of the colonial merchants were still very highly skilled smugglers, so they could usually slip through the blockade when needed. Finally, Parliament responded to the rebellion by authorizing the deployment of around 50,000 troops to North America to crush the rebellion. This included nearly 30,000 British regular troops, who were accounted by many experts to be the finest infantry in the world, as well as 20,000 Hessian or German mercenaries, who were hired from the German state of Hesse to fight on behalf of the British government during this war. The outbreak of fighting and the arrival of British troops in North America made it clear that there was no going back. It was now time to start taking sides. And American colonists slowly began migrating either to the Tory camp, i.e., those loyal to Britain, or to the Patriot camp, i.e., those who supported the revolutionary cause. There was never any formal vote taken on the revolution, and of course, Mr. Gallup and Mr. Zogby and all of the other pollsters that we have today to measure public opinion, they weren't operating back then. So there's no way of knowing for sure exactly how many people supported each side. Early in the war, however, John Adams, who was certainly an astute politician and an observer of the American political climate of the day, he estimated that about one-third of the colonists were for the revolution, about one-third were against it, and another third didn't care either way. Most of the patriots tended to be English colonists, and they usually came from families that had been in North America a long time. The Loyalist camp, by contrast, drew its strongest support from various minority ethnic groups, especially the Germans and the Dutch, because they felt that they could rely on the king and parliament to protect the rights of minorities from the will of the majority, whereas outside the British Empire they felt like they would be vulnerable. As the fighting got underway, however, the Patriot cause received more and more public support. We know this because, among other reasons, more Americans fought for the Patriot side than fought for the British side. This happened for a couple of main reasons. First, because the British government was doing things that seemed hostile to the colonies and their rights. The Prohibitory Act is just one primary example of that. Also, because the Patriots increasingly resorted to the use of vigilante tactics to drive out or silence dissent from the Tory or Loyalist faction. These tactics included whippings, beatings, destruction of personal property, tarring and feathering. You all remember tarring and feathering from the video I showed you in the last lecture. And even in a few cases, the hanging or execution of those who supported the Loyalist cause. Most of these violent activities were carried out not by regular Continental Army troops. Continental Army was the name of the regular American Army during the Revolutionary War. They were not carried out by regular Army troops, but rather by various Patriot militia units then operating in the country. These militia units were basically part-time soldiers with little or no training, and so they weren't of much use in actual battle, but they were extremely effective at quashing any form of resistance to the revolutionary cause. The result was that in most parts of the colonies, loyalists knew that they and their families and property were only protected as long as there were British troops nearby. Everywhere else, they were vulnerable. So even those inclined to support the king were often afraid to do so. And around 80,000 Tories did end up leaving North America because it had become too inhospitable for them to remain there. As a matter of fact, the term lynching actually originated in this period of American history. Today, we usually associate lynching with an extra-legal execution, usually carried out by some sort of hate group like the KKK or the Aryan Nation, for racial motives. But the term lynching originally referred to any kind of violent retribution carried out against those who violated the community's standards. The practice was named after either Charles or William Lynch, two Patriot militia leaders in Virginia, both of whom carried out attacks on loyalists in their areas. Now, as effective as the Patriot militia's vigilante tactics were, however, public support for the revolutionary cause was mainly sustained not by force and intimidation, but by reasoned argument and by political rhetoric. In other words, during the course of the revolution, most people came to agree with the Patriot cause because Patriot spokesmen made effective, reasoned arguments that appealed to the sympathies of the people. These arguments drew heavily on the political ideology of republicanism that had evolved as a result of the influence of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening on the colonies. And we talked about that earlier on in the last lecture. The two best examples of colonial rhetoric in support of the revolution were Tom Paine's influential pamphlet Common Sense and also Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And you can see both of these gentlemen here on the their pictures are here on the slide here. Let me talk to you about Thomas Paine first off. Paine was a man of the Enlightenment and a Republican thinker. He was originally, he was not born in the colonies. He was actually born in England. And he was originally a corset maker, meaning he made ladies' underwear. And for a time he was also an excise officer, meaning a tax collector in England. He basically fled to America after losing his job because he had protested for higher wages and better working conditions for government workers. When he got to America, he became involved in the revolutionary cause, and his pamphlet, Common Sense, was an aggressive attack on the King of England and the entire notion of the divine right of kings. He argued that royalty was an inherently flawed system because having a leader who inherits a title and leadership responsibilities is illogical. It promotes unfit leaders. And instead, Paine advocated rule by the people, or what we would today call popular sovereignty. Paine's Common Sense turned out to be wildly popular. It sold at least 500,000 copies in its first year of publication, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but you got to consider Around that time, there were only around 2.5 million people in the colonies. So it sold about one copy for every five people in the colonies. The success of Common Sense showed that the colonists didn't just desire independence, but that they wanted to form a new government based on the ideas of republicanism. Of course, the official break between the colonies and England came in July of 1776, um, although public sentiment had been moving in the direction of independence for about a year prior to that. So the stage had already been set when on July 2nd, I'll repeat that, July 2nd, 1776, not July 4th, as many people mistakenly believe, the Second Continental Congress formally declared the independence of the 13 colonies from the British Empire. That happened on July 2nd, 1776. But simply declaring independence was not enough. Many of the delegates to the Continental Congress believed that they also needed a document explaining why they had taken this step. So 2 days later, the delegates debated and approved the language of a formal declaration of independence written by Thomas Jefferson, stating the reasons for which the colonies had undertaken to separate themselves from Britain. Uh, Many people also mistakenly believe that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th. It wasn't. It wasn't until almost a month later, on August 2nd, 1776, that most of the delegates to Congress signed the document. The Declaration was drafted, as I said, mainly by Thomas Jefferson, but it was actually drafted by a committee of 5 members, with Thomas Jefferson as the principal author. Benjamin Franklin was also on the committee and made many significant suggestions. After the better-known opening paragraphs, most of the document consisted of a long list of complaints directed against the king, and by implication, Parliament and the rest of the British government as well. Aside from the language of the document itself, there are two important things to keep in mind about the Declaration and about its signers. First, it is important to recognize that these men were taking very, very substantial risks. By signing the document, the signers were basically signing away their lives if the revolution failed. So they clearly believed in what they were doing, and they were willing to risk everything to back it up. Second, by the standards of the day, the men who signed the document were committing high treason. It was treason, after all, to defy a king's authority. The aim of the Declaration of Independence, therefore, was to find a way to justify treason, and they could only do so by appealing to the ideology of republicanism. And the text of the Declaration reflected that ideology. It started with the proposition that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that the purpose of government is to protect and preserve those rights. It goes on to say that if a government, like the British government, begins to threaten those rights, it undermines the basis of its existence, and that at that point, people have the right to take action to change their government by force if necessary. This is essentially the idea of popular sovereignty, which, if you remember from the last lecture, is a critical component of the ideology of republicanism. And this argument proved persuasive to many people in the colonies. Of course, simply having a persuasive argument was not enough to bring about American independence. To do that, the American colonists would have to create a new government, and they'd have to win on the battlefield, or at least wear down the British to the point that they would give up. The colonists faced a number of challenges in making that happen. For one thing, they had no real navy to speak of. There were a few American merchant vessels that were outfitted as privateers, and they did fairly well at raiding British shipping, but for the most part, they didn't field a substantive naval force at any point during the war. They did, however, have to recruit and train an army to combat the roughly 50,000 highly trained British and Hessian troops that the British government had sent against them. Against that enormous force, the A regular American army, which was called the Continental Army, at its highest point had only 17,000 troops, and usually it operated at a strength of somewhere between 10 and 15,000 for most of the war. So if you do the math, it was typically outnumbered anywhere from 3 to 1 to 5 to 1 at any given time. Local militia units added to these numbers, but the militiamen typically weren't that skilled or that well trained, so they couldn't be counted on to stand and fight against tough British redcoats. Despite all that, the British also faced a number of challenges of their own during the war, some of which they mostly overcame, but others continued to cause problems for them throughout the war. There are four challenges in particular we need to know. The first challenge was a logistical one, namely, they had to send troops and supplies roughly 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to fight the war. For the most part, the British met this challenge because they controlled the ocean. They had the largest navy and the largest merchant fleet in the world at that time. Second, in order to win the war, the British had to subdue a large and well dispersed population. They couldn't simply capture a major city like New York or Philadelphia or Boston and call it a day. There was no American capital that they could capture. They had to occupy an entire uh, country or 13 colonies. It was a massive stretch of geographical space that they had to subdue, and the problems of occupying this vast geographic area ultimately proved too much for them. Even though they had more troops, they didn't have enough troops for the task of occupying and pacifying such a large territory. And third, part of the reason why they had problems occupying and holding this territory is because the population was becoming increasingly hostile to them. The very presence of British troops in the colonies only angered the colonial population further. The British troops were, moreover, often cruel to the civilians, especially when they occupied cities like Boston, where there were lots of patriots. During the war, some British officers even talked openly about freeing the slaves as a way of undermining the American war effort, which of course stirred up resentment, particularly in the southern colonies. They also never really used the loyalist population effectively, partly because they didn't think they needed their help, and partly because they couldn't protect them from the Patriot militias once the British troops moved from one area to another. Finally, the British paid a steep price for being overconfident. They continually underestimated the will and the ability of the Continental Army to continue fighting, and as a result, they thought that the fighting would be swift and easy, and it turned out that it wasn't. So those are the major problems faced by the Americans and British, but since we know that the Americans eventually won the war, the question then becomes what factors led to their victory? Well, there are three major ones that we need to be familiar with. First, the Americans won the war in part because they had foreign support, particularly from the French, who entered the war in 1778, on the American side, largely to pay back the British for having defeated them in the French and Indian War several years before. Second, the Americans had the advantage of being underestimated by their opponents. On a number of occasions, especially after big victories, the British failed to follow up their victories by pursuing and crushing the American forces. They kept on thinking that the American army would fall apart eventually, but it didn't. A third key factor in the eventual American victory was the leadership of this fellow, pictured here. And you all know who he is, George Washington, who was early on in the conflict appointed the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Now, as a battlefield commander, Washington did not have an especially impressive win-loss record. There are 10 major battles in the Revolutionary War where he was the primary American commander, and of those 10 battles, he really only won 3 clear-cut victories. These were at the battles of Trenton and Princeton and Yorktown, which we will talk about, to go along with 6 major defeats. Major defeats occurred at the battles of Long Island, Kipps Bay, White Plains, Fort Washington, Brandywine, and Germantown. And there was one other battle, the Battle of Monmouth, which could be considered either a defeat or a tie, depending on how you look at it. So Washington's win-loss record is like 3-7, 3-7, or 3-6-1, depending on how you look at it. It's not very impressive from a numbers perspective. But Washington always seemed to find a way to recover, even after a big defeat. He always seemed to find a way to recover, to regroup, to recruit new reinforcements, to keep his army together and to keep them fighting. More importantly, during the course of the war, he managed to build the Continental Army into a professional, highly disciplined force, basically from scratch. Now, there is a common misunderstanding about the Revolutionary War that the British fought according to customary European linear tactics, or they're also known as Napoleonic tactics, named after Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, while the Americans fought a guerrilla style war, hiding behind rocks and trees, firing from cover. This did happen from time to time, most notably at Lexington and Concord, as we've already discussed, also at the Battle of Kings Mountain in Georgia, and in the Saratoga campaign in New York. But the reality was that George Washington took a great deal of pride in his army as a professional, highly disciplined force that could stand and fight toe to toe against the best troops in the world. He could stand and fight using those classic Napoleonic tactics that I spoke about. By the way, when I talk about Napoleonic tactics, here's an example of what I mean. This is a painting of the Battle of Waterloo. You can see here down at the bottom of the painting there are French troops massing for an attack on the British lines, which can be seen off here in the smoke-shrouded distance. There's French cavalry located down here. You see them on their horses, and they're backing up a long line of French infantry, and they're getting ready for an attack. The classic hallmarks of Napoleonic tactics are tight formations of particularly infantry, maneuvering according to a coordinated plan, coordinating their firepower at masses of enemy troops so as to inflict the maximum possible casualties, and so on. This was a very highly disciplined, highly effective form of 18th century warfare. It was one that the Europeans had mastered, and in order to compete with the British Army, which was one of the best, the most professional forces in the world, Washington had to learn from them to a certain extent. And he had help. Um, he had help in training his army into the professional, highly motivated, highly disciplined fighting force that it became. And the help came from a variety of sources, including two very talented foreign officers, the Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben. Lafayette was a French aristocrat and a follower of the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality, who came to America to fight for those ideals. Steuben, however, was a very different sort of character. He was a minor German aristocrat from Prussia who had some experience in the Prussian military. He also was a very colorful personality. He came to America mainly because he was broke and he needed to find employment, and his only marketable skill was soldiering. So he showed up at Washington's camp in Valley Forge in 1776 with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, whom he had met previously, claiming that he was a former, quote, lieutenant general in the King of Prussia's service. In fact, he had only been a minor staff officer, so he was definitely exaggerating his credentials. Steuben was, however, an excellent drill master and a teacher of military tactics, and he did a lot to help Washington whip the Continental Army into shape. Now, ultimately, The outcome of the Revolutionary War hinged upon three major turning points. These were moments which decisively impacted the course of the war in one direction or another. The first were the battles of Trenton and Princeton from 1776 through 1777. These battles took place in the winter of 1776 through 77, and they occurred more or less at the low point of the revolutionary cause, when it seemed like all might be lost. Washington and the Continental Army had just been driven from New York after suffering a string of bitter defeats in late 1776, including the battles of Long Island, White Plains, and Fort Washington, that had put the survival of the Continental Army in jeopardy. When winter came, the British settled into winter quarters, confident that in the spring they would quickly destroy whatever remained of the American army. But Washington had other ideas. So on Christmas Day, 1776, Washington led his tired, tattered, cold, and hungry army of soldiers across the Delaware River into New Jersey, where they advanced towards the town of Trenton, located right about here. And there they surprised and defeated a small army of Hessian mercenaries, most of whom surrendered and became prisoners of war. 8 days later, he followed up that success with another victory over three British regiments at the Battle of Princeton, also in New Jersey, on January 3rd, 1777. You can see it's right here. Neither of these victories were major victories in terms of their strategic significance or in terms of the number of men or the number of casualties involved, but they were very significant because they gave the American cause a major shot in the arm emotionally, in terms of morale. It made the American troops believe in themselves again, and it gave the colonial public a reason to believe that possibly they could actually prevail in this contest with Great Britain. The next major turning point took place during the Saratoga campaign in upstate New York in September and October of 1777. The British general, John Burgoyne, led an army of 7,000 British regulars south from Canada. Their intention was to march down the Hudson River Valley. You can see the Hudson River right here. It runs up through upstate New York up to the St. Lawrence River. Their intention was to march down the Hudson River Valley, eventually linking up with British forces marching northward from New York City under General John Howe. If successful, they would cut off any supply and communication lines between New England and the rest of the country. So they would essentially cut the colonies in half. Instead, Burgoyne's men found themselves attacked and harassed at every turn by American forces. As they marched further into the interior of New York, their supply lines became overstretched and vulnerable to attack by hostile American militia troops. Moreover, Burgoyne had counted on support from British allied Indian tribes and local Tories, both to help guard his supply convoys and also to provide him with intelligence about enemy movements on his flanks and in his rear and so on. And they never showed up, leaving Burgoyne's army essentially stumbling blind through the wilderness of upstate New York. Burgoyne's army was eventually cut off and surrounded, and he surrendered his entire force at Saratoga, New York on October 17th, 1777. The victory at Saratoga is significant for two reasons. Number one, it does take a large British army essentially out of the fight, about 7,000 troops, as I said before. But even more important, it helped to bring the French into the war on the American side. The French government had been waiting for a big American victory to give them an excuse to join the fighting so that they could pay back the British for defeating them in the French and Indian War. And Saratoga was just the excuse that they needed. The third and final turning point came at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The main British general in the southern colonies, Lord Charles Cornwallis, had withdrawn to Yorktown on the coast of Virginia um, in order to take on supplies and reinforcements from the sea. He just had a very unsuccessful campaign in the Carolinas, and he needed to get new supplies and new troops. Um, Washington, however, had just been reinforced by the arrival of a substantial French army and, most significantly, a large French fleet. The French army was under the command of the Marquis de Rochambeau, and the French fleet was under the command of Admiral de Grasse. Um, and so he took advantage of this situation to move his combined army of American and French troops from New York down to Virginia. They settled, they basically walled off this peninsula where Yorktown is located, and they laid siege to Yorktown by land. At the same time, the French fleet moved down from waters off of Newport, Rhode Island, and they moved down to the Chesapeake Bay, where in early September they defeated and drove off the British fleet at the Battle of the Capes from September 5th through September 8th. And as a result, Cornwallis now finds himself bottled up both by land and by sea. He runs low on supplies, on food and ammunition, and eventually he is compelled to surrender to Washington. And he surrenders his entire army. It is the Battle of Yorktown that eventually ends the Revolutionary War. Even though the war officially would last for another 2 years, the Battle of Yorktown is the last major military engagement between American and British forces. It's clear to nearly everybody after this battle that the British really can't continue fighting. The war has lasted too long. It's been too expensive for them. Their losses have been too high, and the British public was growing increasingly sick of the war, of continuing the war in the Americas. Um, so the American and French victory at Yorktown proved to be the last major military engagement of the war. 2 years later, the war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris. I'll move back up. The Treaty of Paris in 1783. In this treaty, the British government recognized American independence, and it agreed to set the border between the United States and Canada at roughly its current location. The treaty further promised that Britain would move its garrisons out of certain British forts that still remained in the American frontier region of the West, although, as we'll see later, they did not completely follow through on that promise. So, obviously, the revolution's most significant and lasting impact was that it led to American independence and to the creation of a new nation. But the revolution also had other significant side effects for particular groups within the United States, especially for African Americans, women, Indians, and even lower class white Americans, white males. By the end of the war, around 5,000 free blacks had fought on the Patriot side, a fact that is often neglected, is often not mentioned in textbooks and in classic accounts of the war, but it is true that the Continental Army actually received substantial support from African Americans serving in their ranks. Many slaves in the South, moreover, were heavily affected by the revolutionary spirit of the age. They had heard a lot of revolutionary rhetoric from their masters about freedom and independence, and they took the message to heart, and they acted on it in many cases by resorting to the simple expedient of running away. Historians estimate that somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 slaves decided that they were going to pursue happiness with their feet, meaning they would leave their farms and their plantations and flee to the north, try and blend in with the free black population in some of the northern states, or flee to Canada or elsewhere. Um, the British Army, moreover, sought to use the slaves to their advantage during the war. In the South, slaves that ran away to the British lines were granted protection from their masters, and many of them actually fought for the British side. Other runaways were employed by the British as laborers, digging ditches, building forts, and so on. The British also tried to provoke slave revolts in the South, though mostly without success, and such actions usually ended up antagonizing Southern whites and pushing many of them into the revolutionary camp. Moreover, many of the slaves who did go over to the British side were tragically re-enslaved in the British Sugar Islands after the war. The Revolutionary War also entailed many new opportunities for women. During the war, lots of women took over household duties that were usually reserved for men, particularly farm or agricultural labor, because the men were away fighting. Some women even took over the management of farms and businesses that had been left unmanaged by the departure of their husbands or brothers and so on. The war did not, however, fundamentally change colonial gender relations, which pretty much returned to normal patterns after the war, or what were then considered to be normal patterns. Um, the war also entailed many profound consequences for the North American Indian tribes that were then present. Throughout the colonial period, Native American tribes in North America had survived and sometimes even thrived by functioning in what has been called a sort of middle ground between competing European powers. This is the frontier area between the colonial empires of Britain and France and so on. They frequently succeeded by playing off one European power against another. The British against the French, the British against the Spanish, and so on. But with the victory of the Americans in the Revolutionary War, the middle ground was lost. Once the Treaty of Paris was signed, the Indians suddenly found themselves confronted by a single implacable foe. That was the new American Republic. A foe that was, moreover, dedicated to a policy of westward expansion. Gone was the proclamation line. Gone was the British attempt to restrain the spread of settlement of its American colonists westward. So the Indians are now faced with a dramatically increased threat of white expansionist settlement spilling over the Appalachians into their traditional hunting grounds, into their traditional territory. The Americans didn't know it yet, but the end of the war also portended profound cultural changes in their society. One of those changes was the gradual end of the tradition of social deference showed by lower class or non-elite Americans towards their social betters in the upper class. Gradually, more and more members of the lower and middle classes of American society began seeking public office, becoming more vocal in politics, demanding to be treated as equals by the elites of American society. And part of this transition had to do with the shared experience of fighting and winning a war against the biggest military power on earth at that time, which gave a lot of ordinary Americans confidence in their own abilities. It also had to do with the removal of a large portion of the old social elite of colonial society, those who had been loyalists, who had fled the country during and after the Revolution, creating a vacuum of social and political leadership which many other non-elite people rose to fill. All right, so that's the end of our lecture on the American Revolution. Hope you've enjoyed it. Um, and we'll pick up next time with the next topic. Adios.